Sometimes dead is better. But not in this case. So far as I know, you can't listen to soundtracks when you're dead, but boy, do I hope you can. Today we're going to be talking about the wonderful, horrific soundtrack to the 1989 horror film Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Boy, this is the stuff of nightmares, you better believe it, and it is transmuted by the magnificent Elliot Goldenthal in every terrifying note that he wrote for this soundtrack. I'm Ted, the soundtrack guy. Stick with me until the end of this video. You'll have an opportunity to listen to what I have to say about another horrific soundtrack written by the great Jerry Goldsmith for a film that I consider to be a haunted house movie in outer space. Yes, you guessed it, it's Alien. Now, what's the connection? Well, in Pet Sematary, we have perhaps the Wendigo or the evil demonic spirits luring Louis Creed to the Micmac burying grounds. And in Alien, we have Weyland-Yutani luring Ripley and the crew of Nostromo to the planet LV-426. Not only that, but the music in both cases is absolutely blood-chillingly scary. And speaking of being traumatized by this film as a youngster, I know I'm not alone when I say that. My wife claims that when she saw Pet Sematary as a young kid, it traumatized her so profoundly that she had to confess she didn't even know what the definition of fear was until she saw this movie. And there's one character in particular that I've found strikes a common chord of fear in the hearts of so many. And yes, you guessed it, her name is Zelda, the one and only infamous Zelda. I get chills just saying her name right now. And when I was a kid, my introduction to this movie was I was staying over at a friend's house. It was a sleepover, and his dad took us to Blockbuster Video, and something about Pascal's face on the cover of that VHS tape caught our eye, and for a wonder, his dad let us rent this movie. We got all the way until the very end when Gage comes back, and we were so traumatized that we shut that puppy off and we went to bed and tried to forget all about it. The next morning, it was sunny outside and all of our fears seemed to have been swept away, and we threw that VHS back in the player and tried to pick up where we left off, and his dad came marching into the room and ejected that tape and threw it back in to the Blockbuster clamshell and went and took it back. He said, "There is no way you're gonna watch this." Well, since I have seen it many a time and I have read the novel at least 4 or 5 times so far, it is easily one of my favorite Stephen King stories, and certainly one of the scariest. Now, critics didn't really appreciate this movie, but audiences gobbled this up. It made a lot of money at the box office, and I can see why it did, because it really strikes a raw chord that not many horror films are capable of doing. Now, interestingly, George Romero, who many rightly consider to be the godfather of the zombie film, was slated to direct Stephen King's Pet Sematary, but by the time Paramount Pictures was ready to make this film, by the time Stephen King had finished the original screenplay for this film, he was no longer available, and so the directorial job fell to, of course, Mary Lambert, who, in my opinion, did a wonderful job with this material. And though it is a far from perfect movie, it does manage to capture the electrifying terror and atmosphere and overall feeling that that novel evoked. And I am a staunch believer that Elliot Goldenthal's score played no small part in the film's effectiveness. So let's get into this particular album, shall we? This is La La Land's 2013 re-release, which is completely remastered with exceptional clarity in the sound quality. This is really something to talk about, and presents the complete score in chronological film order, plus bonuses and alternate takes. So 19 film tracks in chronological order and 11 bonus tracks totaling 30 tracks of terror and over an hour of music. There was a previous soundtrack release for Pet Sematary the year the movie came out in 1989 by Pet Sematary. I had that album back in the day and I listened to it to death. I really liked that album a lot. Now, Mondo Records also released the soundtrack to Pet Sematary on vinyl in 2014, which notably includes the 2 songs that the Ramones wrote specifically for this movie. But as terrific as both of those releases are, the award for Best Release for the soundtrack to Pet Sematary has to go to this release by La La Land Records. The packaging is just beautiful. I mean, I could stare at this CD all day long. And inside, we've got one of the greatest booklets that I've ever encountered as a soundtrack collector. The liner notes are incisive, detailed by John Takis. He gives us a track-by-track analysis of every single track, the entire score in chronological order, as well as all the bonus material and alternates, with truly graphically impressive photos. I mean, the original booklet in the Varese Sarabande CD was pretty bland, and that was true of a lot of Varese Sarabande's older releases. And you open up that insert and inside you might have a couple of black and white photographs and maybe a repeat of the track listing or something like that. And that's just the way things were with soundtracks back in the day. So it's certainly not a knock or a criticism. I love my Varese Sarabande. By the way, see my pin I'm wearing there on my lapel? But the new booklet in the La La Land re-release for 2013 is just a treasure trove and a feast for the eyes. Now, the music that Elliot Goldenthal wrote for Stephen King's Pet Sematary was his breakout soundtrack. And personally, it's my favorite Elliot Goldenthal score, right alongside Alien 3 and Interview with a Vampire. Now, why do I love this soundtrack so much? Why is it so high in my estimation in the canon for Elliot Goldenthal? One of the reasons is that this is an intimate soundtrack. This is probably like a chamber style soundtrack, and it emphasizes the strings and piano and choral work by a boys choir, as well as a lot of synth work that's very finely done and very, very nicely wedded with the recording of the live instrumentation section. And the only 2 live instruments that were recorded for this soundtrack were the piano, which Elliot Goldenthal plays himself on this album, as well as the string pieces. And that, of course, includes the harp. And there's actually, ironically, a lot of harp in this soundtrack, but it's not being played, with this ethereal beauty, kind of like, maybe fairy dusting effect. No, this harp is used for plucking, dreadful, kind of metronomical and almost pseudo heartbeat type effect as a way of rising the tension, increasing the terror, and bringing you to the edge of a scream just before, in a lot of cases, Elliot Goldenthal will just tear open your throat with dissonant blasts of music that just cause you to jump clean out of your seat. The score is essentially the oral equivalent of the cold, clammy hand of a corpse sort of settling over the back of your neck. And this remastering, as well as the way it was written and recorded, you can hear all the articulation of the instrumentation in this. It's just so nuanced and so punctuated. And I suppose it should come as no surprise that Bernard Herrmann's classic soundtrack for Psycho was a huge inspiration for Elliot Goldenthal as far as the exclusive string writing and the growing intensity effect is concerned. Now, in the same way that Herrmann's score for Psycho is a lot deeper and more magnificent than it would first appear on the surface, perhaps, to the casual listener, Elliot Goldenthal's music in Pet Sematary is really something special. This isn't just your typical slasher horror soundtrack with not much depth to it. This has actually got a startling amount of depth to it, and some of the waters are even black. It is so deep, you cannot see the bottom. This score is unrelentingly dreadful and tinged. This is a special part of this score. It's tinged with this terrible sadness and loss. It's actually very poignant in a lot of cases. And this music is not merely ambient, although sometimes it does go for ambience when it's setting the tone and the mood in certain scenes of this movie, but it also is very effective thematically and melodically. But aside from speaking about this fantastically chilling little score in general terms, Ted, do you have any favorite tracks from this soundtrack? You better believe I do. The first track that I absolutely love on this score is, maybe not so surprisingly, titled The Pet Sematary, and this is, in fact, the first track on the album. We have the boys' choir, the Zarathustra Boys Chorus, singing the vocals to this little tune that's really chilling and kind of reminds me of the music in Rosemary's Baby and the Amityville Horror and even Children of the Corn. And it's this creepy sing-song tune with kind of this toy piano or this music box kind of sound behind it and the strings going. And the main tune, I'll kind of try to demonstrate this for you, but I'll be at least a few octaves lower than this boys' choir. It's something like la 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 la. Really creepy stuff. And there's also a B section theme in this first track, and it's played on piano. It's this very lachrymose sounding music that illustrates Lewis's tragic choices coming up here in the film that we were about to see. And it's just very, very dramatically effective, because not only does it illustrate Lewis's tragic choices, but it also is playing upon the happier family love bond that Elliot Goldenthal illustrates in a waltz that he has written for this soundtrack, and that comes up a number of times throughout the course of the movie, and even raises its head again once the horror really starts getting going, and once the tragedy is already underway. Only then it changes shades and goes from being kind of this almost whimsical, lyrical waltz. It's this la da la da la da 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 da. And it's just wonderfully gorgeous, but something else about it is that I can't help but feel like, as much as it illustrates that familial love bond that this family has for each other, it's also kind of suggestive of this sort of waltzing off the edge of a cliff in this blitheful state, or maybe compulsorily, as the family is being drawn into the dark wishes of the spirits in the Micmac burying grounds beyond the Pet Sematary. Now, the next musical observation that I'm going to be sharing with you about Elliot Goldenthal's score to Pet Sematary, those horror aficionados out there are probably going to get a kick out of this one. Have you ever noticed that the third track on the soundtrack to Pet Sematary, titled The Path/Lullaby Waltz, sounds an awful lot, and I almost mean to say it sounds exactly a lot like the main hall track in the soundtrack to the remake of Resident Evil. And it's that kind of ghostly sounding And then, believe it or not, to go further with the same comparison of those two soundtracks, the fourth track on Pet Sematary, The Warning Tour, sounds a lot like the music in the remake to Resident Evil during the guardhouse part. I think it's actually called the Guardhouse 2 on the OST to that game soundtrack, and it's not quite as literally the same, but it definitely evokes the same kind of feeling and tone as the music that is going on when Pascal wakes up, essentially in Lewis's arms, after having been struck by a truck. And in Resident Evil, it's that. And this track from Pet Sematary really just kind of like goes with that feeling. It's this oozing horror, totally unnerving. There's dark textures in there. And as this track goes on, it kind of moves away from that exact comparison, but still kind of stays within the tonality that I'm talking about. And Elliot Goldenthal has these moaning, chilling synth voices in there that are almost singing in a way, like the Micmac grounds are calling to Lewis. And this is as Pascal is giving him that tour to the Pet Sematary and warning him that the barrier was not meant to be crossed. The ground is sour. Another of my favorite tracks on this soundtrack is track 5, and it's another one of those instances where there is another mashup of a lot of different moments in the film, and the track is titled Halloween / Thanksgiving / Deadfall Invitation / To the Micmac Grounds. Now, it's the latter two instances that I want to focus in on momentarily when it comes to this particular track. It's wonderful. It has some Native American kind of mysticism suggested in this music, and it's very powerful. And I always thought to myself when I was listening to this soundtrack that there's space all of a sudden in the score. And what I mean by that is there's like elbow room, whereas before it almost feels a little claustrophobic. It feels very chamber. It was recorded in that particular environment, and perhaps even intentionally it gives you this kind of suffocating feeling most of the time. But in these moments of this track, you really do feel like, the aerial shots that you get over the Micmac burying grounds, you have that kind of air in this music. And I think that Goldenthal achieved it using the electronic synth, and it's just a fantastic effect and very unique to the score. And the next few tracks do a very effective job of preparing us, setting us up for the horror, the rising horror that is soon to come. We've got the morose piano music for the Missy Dandridge suicide scene, which in my estimation is preparing us to hear Rachel's account of what happened to her as a child when she was taking care of her sister Zelda, who was dying of spinal meningitis. And that is, of course, probably the scariest, most traumatizing moment in the entire movie, and the music is really chilling. It's this heart-achingly sad and very simplistic piano melody that is also totally horrifying and kind of subdued. It's very, very softly and gently played at the beginning of this track, and there's kind of this almost knuckles on wood knocking sound that's going along with this piano kind of tinkling, sorrowful melody while Rachel is taking care of her dying sister. And then it just rises and rises and rises until, again, it explodes in this jarring, almost dissonant way as Zelda is dying. And speaking of chill factor, track 10, which is titled The Kite / Rachel's Dirty Secret / Up in Flames, when Judd is giving his cautionary tale to Lewis in the latter segment of that track, we've got this spiraling, horrific reprise of the main theme that blends into the fiery, malevolent statement of the B theme, appropriately enough, as Timmy Baterman's house is set ablaze. And it's this really creepy, faster tempo, la 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 la, and you've got this kind of, I want to say it's a synth violin effect. It's and then it's almost like the boys' choirs are getting a little bit kind of wicked in themselves. It's la 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 la, and then the immolation moment when the fire is churning. It's that la 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 la. La 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 la. And then in track 13, this track is titled Gentle Exhuming / Dead Recollection. We have this most heart-achingly sorrowful variation on that family waltz as Lewis is sitting on the edge of his son's opened grave and he's rocking Gage back and forth in his arms. It truly is a terribly sad moment and dreadful moment and just chilling moment, all of the above, all at the same time. You feel like you're just on this slope and you are helplessly going to a place that you could not have fathomed in your wildest nightmares, but it's inevitable at this point. And then as if to prove that point in the at your throat way that Goldenthal is so good at demonstrating in this soundtrack, the next half of that track is the Dead Recollection scene. And it's the moment where Rachel is having that nightmare about her dead sister Zelda, and Goldenthal goes all out. He's got this nightmare horrifying effect going. We've got harp runs and disconcerting strings and kind of this as the harp runs are going, you know, and it just like the camera work is tilted too. It's almost like tilting in a hallway effect, and it's just this lilting horror, and that's exactly what this music sounds like. And then finally, the next 4 tracks in this score are just the equivalent of like being eviscerated and your guts are spilling out of your belly. It's musically, this is what this is like. This is the final act of the movie. Gage has returned from the grave, or some malevolent spirit inhabiting his tiny little body has returned from the grave. And this is the return game track. And this is where Gage is in Judd's house toying with him until he finally murders him in his upstairs bedroom. And Elliot Goldenthal's music is just incredibly agitated on strings, rising to that moment, and then finally culminating in this savage, violent, slashing piece of music that is actually quite reminiscent to Herman's shower scene in a lot of ways, but it's more unhinged even than that. It's just this wild, demonic frenzy sound. And then for the section of music where Rachel returns home and she goes into Judd's house, Goldenthal gives us this chillingly, almost icy sounding, eerie, empty string work. It almost sounds like maybe how wind whistling through a keyhole or through an empty space in the forest might sound like on strings. And it just builds and builds in kind of almost this seasick way as she's going upstairs and she finally confronts this revenant of her sister, which ultimately turns out to be the thing that has returned in Gage's body. And then finally, the 4th track in this segment that we're discussing now, which is titled The Return Game 2, we have a return to those frenetic strings that we heard from the original The Return game that were psycho-like but more unhinged. And they're even more intense now than they were before. And once again, after Lewis manages to inject the Gage thing with the morphine syringe, and the Gage thing is kind of wandering off, almost hurt feeling like, it goes back to that sad piano rendition of the waltz. And it's enough to break your heart in the midst of the abject terror that you're experiencing simultaneously. And then, of course, to sum up this score, we get one more solo rendition of the family waltz, one more chilling moment. And just as the film cuts to black once Rachel's swinging the knife toward Lewis's head, we get the Ramones singing, "I don't want to be buried in the Pet Sematary. I don't want to live my life again." Anyway, this is a fantastic horror soundtrack. I highly recommend it. It is sold out, but track it down. It is worth your time. Now, as promised, here is the soundtrack to Jerry Goldsmith's science fiction horror masterpiece of a score for the 1979 film Alien. Click this video right here and enjoy. I'll see you next time, and in the meantime, happy listening.